First thing I want you to do this morning is open your Bible to the table of contents. Or you can, electronic devices have those too. I'm not joking. Actually, I want you to do this, okay? So it should be toward the beginning somewhere, obviously. So once you get to the table of contents, I want you to find the book of Job. Now, for some of you, it looks like Job, okay? But it's pronounced Job. It's spelled Job. So, you got it? So what's the book after Job? Psalms. And then after that, you've got Ecclesiastes, and then you've got... All right, so the reason I've had you turn here, and the reason these 5 books are all put together in the Old Testament is because this is the grouping of books that we refer to as the wisdom books. This means that the content of these 5 books are not primarily historical narrative, they're not prophecy, they're not law, but these books contain the wisdom of real people given to us under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. But this is the wisdom of real people, listen now, at their highs and at the real lows of life. There's poetry in these books, and most people find them highly accessible and find them human, and these are, for this reason, many people's favorite books in the Old Testament. Today we're beginning a series in the first of these 5 books, the book of Job. So now, look at the page number and turn to the book of Job, or access the book of Job through your electronic device. So we're beginning a series in the book of Job, and the series is titled Lessons Learned in Suffering. Lessons Learned in Suffering. Now, just to give you a little bit of insight about the book of Job, no one really knows who wrote the book of Job. Some people think Job wrote Job, but that's not certain. No one really knows exactly what time period the book of Job was written, but generally between 2000 and 500 BC, and that's a huge, that's like a 1,500-year time span. We just don't know. But in this book of Job, we find great wisdom to people who are in the midst of suffering. What do you mean by suffering, Pastor James? Well, Merriam-Webster's dictionary defines suffering as, quote, pain that is caused by injury, illness, loss, etc., etc., etc. But what I'd like to do this morning is I'd like to offer up to you what I believe is a more insightful definition that I've discovered. And here's what it is. Some of you may want to write this down, so get your pen ready. Quote, here's the definition I think is better, which is this. Suffering is your response to the taking away of something that is important to you. Suffering is your response to the taking away of something that is important to you. Suffering is your response to the taking away of something that is important to you. Now, many of you have probably not thought of suffering like this. But for the next 8 weeks, we will be in suffering. And let me just say, I've been dying to say that. Some of you are like, Pastor James, we are in suffering every time you preach. And so you know suffering well. But we're going to be in suffering, and we're going to deep down, and we're going to look at the suffering that is caused in our lives when something is taken away from us. It could be our job, it could be our health, it could be a person, but it's our response when something that is important to us is taken away. And so we're going to dig deep. We're going to work our way through Job's wisdom. We're going to discover lessons learned in suffering, and we're going to see 8 lessons as we go through this series. Now, for those of you who have known great suffering, maybe you're sitting here today and you're in the midst of suffering and you've known great suffering. Let me just say that you're searching for wisdom here. You're searching for answers. You want this. You've been ready for this series. You've known it was coming, and you've been eagerly awaiting this because you recognize immediately your need for wisdom here. But then some of you may be sitting in here right now thinking, why do we really need to do an entire series on the topic of suffering? Why not a happier theme? Pastor James, don't bum me out, Pastor James. Pastor James, isn't really what suffering people need, isn't what they really need is a cheery word? Why are you going to talk about suffering? Well, I'm going to address why we need to spend 8 weeks in suffering as we move through the book of Job, and we'll discover that when I introduce our first lesson today, but that's going to come in just a little while. So you're going to have to wait for the first lesson. You're going to have to wait just a few minutes for lesson number 1 about suffering, because before we go there, we need to meet the man for which this book is named. We need to meet Job. So Job chapter 1, let's read verses 1 through 5. Job chapter 1, verses 1 through 5. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. And that man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. That's the kind of guy he was. There was born to him 7 sons and 3 daughters. He possessed 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, and very many servants, so that this man was the greatest of all the people of the east. His sons used to go and hold a feast in the house of each one on his day, and they would send and invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. And when the days of the feast had run their course, Job would send and consecrate them. He would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings according to the number of them all. Here's why. Job said, "It may be that my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." Thus Job did continually. Now I want you to notice the first words of verse 1. It says this: there was a man named, or there was a man. And I think it's highly significant that it begins by saying there was a man, because this is the story of a real person. Are y'all getting me? This is not some fairy tale. This is a true story about a person who has feelings, who has needs, who has desires, who experiences pain just like me and just like you. And this is one reason that this book will speak so powerfully to us, wherever we may find ourselves this morning. Okay, so what kind of man was Job? Well, let me make a couple points. And really, the text, I believe, makes a couple big statements about Job. First, Job was a great man of great faith. Job was a great man of great faith. Once again, in verse 1, there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. So if you look at the words used to describe the kind of man that Job was, the words that are used are words like blameless. Blameless does not mean sinless, first of all. And this is very important as we trek our way through the book, that you recognize right now, that you remember, so hear me, is Job sinless? No. Who's the only sinless person? Jesus, right? And Adam and Eve before sin entered the world, but he's the only so blameless doesn't mean sinless. No one is sinless other than Jesus. The word blameless basically means complete. And so he is complete as in the sense that he is like spiritually mature. He's not fully matured, but he's a mature he's a mature person spiritually. He's balanced, he's genuine, he's authentic. You couldn't easily point a finger at Job's life and say, man, look at all that messed up stuff there, right? He's blameless in that sense, but not sinless. Secondly, he's described as being upright, and this just means that in human relationships, Job deals straight. He doesn't double-cross people. He has integrity in his business dealings. He's upright. Thirdly, he is described as a man who feared God. That is, that he had a reverence, a piety, a bowing down before the God who made the world and before the God who sustains him, and this resulted in him honoring the Lord. And then fourthly, it says that he turns from evil. He was a guy who turned from evil. And the idea is that as Job walked through life, he resolutely stayed on the straight and the upright path. When temptations came that would lead him to stray away from correct, God-honoring path, he turned away from those temptations. So Job is presented to us as a man of God. And men, you need to perk up your ears and you need to take notice, because this is the kind of man you should want to be. And so as remarkable as this description is of Job, it's all the more remarkable when we recognize that he is a man from Uz. Now, I don't know. This is just funny to me. Uz reminds me of Oz, right? I mean, I don't know how you can not be reminded of that, but he's a man from Uz. Well, why is that significant? Here's why it's significant. He is from Uz, not from Israel. He is a godly man, the greatest of all the men in the East, and he is not from Israel, he is from us. He didn't know the law given by Moses later on in history. He was very much like Abraham, in that he was kind of there, and he knew the Lord. So this is pretty amazing. Job is a man of God. It's amazing all the way around. He didn't have the light and the witness that you and I have through church or through Scripture, but he honored the Lord and he was a man of God. So he's a great man of great faith. Secondly, Job was a great man of great fortune. In verses 2 and 3, it describes everything that Job had. He had 7 sons, 3 daughters, 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, and many servants, so that this man was the greatest of all the people of the East. Now, we can easily break down Job's fortune into 2 categories. First, his family. The Bible tells us that being blessed with many children is like having a quiver of arrows, like it's a blessing. And so Job was a blessed man. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters. Secondly, second category of his fortune was his possessions. Verse 3 tells us Job was a prosperous man. He was very much like a rich rancher. As a matter of fact, he was so prosperous, he had so much, how much is 7,000 sheep? That's a lot of sheep. And so Job wasn't just rich, Job was famously rich. We have people in our day that are famously rich. You know what I'm saying? Job was famously rich. He was famous just for his wealth. As a matter of fact, the Bible says that he was the greatest man in the Middle Eastern society. So just a quick note here, Job was both rich and godly. He wasn't just one or the other. He didn't allow his possessions to possess him or to lead him down an unrighteous path. Once again, this is an amazing thing, because what often do riches do? Lead you to stray away from the Lord, but that's not what happened in the case of Job. So Job was a great man of great faith, number one. Secondly, as we meet Job, he was a great man of great fortune. Thirdly, as we meet Job, Job was a great man with great spiritual sensitivities. He had great spiritual sensitivity. In verse 4 and 5, it says, his sons used to go and hold a feast in the house of each one on his day, and they would send and invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. And when the days of the feast had run their course, Job would send and consecrate them, and he would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, here's why he was doing it, it may be that my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. Thus Job did continually. He was a spiritual, he had great spiritual sensitivity. Well, what do you mean by this? Well, what I mean by this is that Job was a dad who was spiritually sensitive about his children's relationship with God. Are you hearing me, man? He was sensitive about where his kids were in their relationship with God, and so ought you to be. And so ought you to be, ladies. These verses tell us that Job's 7 sons each would have a party on his day. And we're not really sure exactly what this means on his day. Perhaps it refers to on their birthday, maybe, but we're not positive about that. But they'd have a party. And I can remember the first time I read this, I thought, man, is this one of those parties where maybe the sisters are passed out drunk, like a sorority thing? At the end of it, like, is this why? Like, were they partying so hard that Job had to go and offer an offering for the forgiveness of their sins, as a result of their partying? Is that what's happening here? That is not what is happening here. Do not misunderstand or read into the word party something that should not be read into the word party. Just because you've had a bad experience with parties doesn't mean that's what it's talking about here. Job had raised these children well. So why the offering and the concern then, Pastor James? Listen, the parties were a celebration. They were made possible due to an overflow of material blessings. Job was rich, the kids were rich. And so why the offering? Here's why. Because Job knew that when things are going well, what often happens to people's hearts? And we've already highlighted this. But what often happens to people's hearts when they're affluent and things are going well? They don't draw closer to God, even though that's what blessings are supposed to work in our life. But often what they do is they make us self-satisfied and our hearts stray away from God. Job is a wise man. He knows that this is a reality that he has to battle, and he knows this is a reality his kids have to battle. And so just in case, Job, immediately after the celebrations, would rise early and offer a burnt offering to the Lord. Once again, for Job said that it may be that my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. Now, in Scripture, a burnt offering is always a symbol of the total dedication of something to God. It's an awareness of God's rightful ownership over not just part of us, but all of us. Sometimes people talk about, hey, we need to give God 10%. The reality is, we're called to give God 100%. A burnt offering is the sacrifice we know historically of a male animal. They would take the healthiest, the most perfect, the best animal of their herd or flock. It needed to be without blemish, and the perfection of the burnt offering, we know later on, symbolizes the perfection of the ultimate sacrifice, whose name was what? Jesus. And so when Job sacrificed a burnt offering for the sake of his children, he was expressing his spiritual heart for them. Job desired that all of his children would belong fully to God. And so in the burnt offering, the whole animal would be burnt, nothing left. It was all God's. And he's saying, God, my kids are all yours. My family is all yours. You ever prayed that, God? Just like, you take my kids, you take my family, you take my wealth. And we don't mean take it away, right? But we're just saying it's all yours. All of it belongs to you. It's recognition of God's ownership over them. So Job is a great man of great faith, great fortune, great spiritual sensitivity. And all that's good, but here's where it gets hard. The fourth point. What else was Job? Number four. Job was a great man who experiences great suffering. Job was a great man who experiences great suffering. Suffering that I can't even begin to imagine. So what kind of suffering did Job experience? And we're going to get into more of the details of this next week, but what kind of suffering does Job experience? We'll first look in chapter 1, skip over to verse 13. Here's what happens to Job. So Job is this great man who loves God and walks with God. He's upright, he's righteous. All of his family is given to God, including himself. All of his stuff has been given to God, and God takes it. Verse 13, now there was a day when his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. And there came a messenger to Job and said, the oxen were plowing and the donkeys feeding beside them, and the Sabaeans fell upon them and took them and struck down the servants with the edge of the sword. And I alone have escaped to tell you. All of his servants were slaughtered. People that he knew, maybe from the time that they were children. While he was yet speaking, there came another and said, the fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them, and I alone have escaped to tell you. So he lost all of his animals. While he was yet speaking, there came another and said, the Chaldeans formed 3 groups and made a raid on the camels and took them and struck down the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was yet speaking, there came another and said, your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house, and behold, a great wind came across the wilderness, struck the 4 corners of the house. It fell upon the young people, and they are all dead. And I alone have escaped to tell you. Then Job arose and tore his robe, and shaved his head, and fell on the ground and worshipped. And he said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord, he must have said, with a trembling voice and a tear-stained face. In all this, it says, Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. This, however, is not the end of Job's suffering. If you turn over to chapter 2 and look in verses 7 through 9, it continues. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and struck Job with loathsome sores from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head, and he took a piece of broken pottery with which to scrape himself while he sat in the ashes. Then his wife said to him, "Do you still hold fast to your integrity? Curse God and die." The sermon series is named Lessons Learned in Suffering. So what is lesson number 1? Ready? And this is going to just pick you up and make you want to shout for joy. Lesson number 1 is this: no one is immune from suffering. No one is immune from suffering. Not Job, not Jesus, not me, and not you. No one is immune from suffering. Now here's the reason why, and listen is more sure in life than the reality that at some point you personally will experience suffering. You will experience this at some point. At some point, you're going to have something taken away from you. It may be a loved one. It may be your job. It may be your dream. It may be your stuff. It may be your goal. It may be your plan. It might be your health. But at some point, every person suffers. We live in a fallen world. Now, as you sit here today, you are all in one of 3 places. Number 1, suffering is ahead of you. It's coming. Number 2, suffering is upon you. And you don't need to tell me that suffering is a part of life because you're in it right now. Or number 3, suffering has just passed you by and now you're on the other side of whatever that day of suffering was, and you're on the other side, and you know that suffering is a reality. Listen, lesson number 1 is this: no one is immune from suffering. No one. Now, Pastor James, thanks for bumming me out. That's what I'm here for. No, seriously though, I'm not trying to bum you out, but it's really important. And this is the lesson for today. This is the point. No one's immune from suffering. Well, why are you going to preach a whole sermon on that? Like, you just made your point. This is a record. We're going to get out of church early. Not yet. Because now we need to talk about why we need to understand that no one is immune from suffering. Why is it important that we get this? Well, I want to bring out to you 3 reasons why it's important. 3 reasons why it's vitally important that you understand that you are not immune from suffering. Reason number 1 is this: when you realize that no one is immune from suffering, it puts you in the wheelchair. That's the first reason. Well, what do you mean by that, Pastor James? Well, I've got 2 kinds of chairs, just because I want this to stick in your brain. I got 2 kinds of chairs. They're going to be up here through the whole series, up here on stage. We've got an armchair, and we've got a wheelchair. Do you know that the world looks different depending on whatever chair you're sitting in? You're sitting in the armchair? Woo! Actually, I might stay here. You sit in the armchair, life is good. I'm kicked back. I'm relaxed. I'm at peace. I'm not asking why, God. I'm saying thank you, God. It's good. Life is good here. Life looks different here. But when you come over here and you sit in the wheelchair, it's a lot different. When you're sitting in the wheelchair, you're asking questions that you're not asking when you're sitting in the armchair. You're asking, how much more of this can I take? You're asking, why me? You're asking God, what in the world could be the good in this? You're questioning Romans 8. God works all things out for the good of those who love Him and are called according to His purpose. I don't see it, God. And when your loved one is sitting in the wheelchair, you're asking the same questions. You see, my point is, the world looks different depending on what place you're sitting in. There are times in life that we're sitting in this chair, and there are times of life that we're sitting in this chair. That's why we need a sermon series on suffering. That's why we need to understand what the truths that we're going to learn in this series. We need a word from God that speaks to us, not just when we're sitting here, but we need a word from God that speaks to us when we're sitting here. And we're all going to sit here at some point. Shakespeare said, and you got to be careful what you listen to him about, but Shakespeare said this: "He jests at scars that never felt a wound." The person who jests at other people's scars is the person who have never felt the wound themselves. But if you felt the wound, you don't jest. Don't jest about the wheelchair view. Don't scoff. Don't say, "I will never sit here," because once again, the lesson number one is that no one is immune from suffering. So the first reason we need lesson number one is because because it puts us in the wheelchair, and we need to understand what it's like and how to handle life when we're sitting in this view. Reason number two that we need lesson number one, there you go, is because when we learn this truth, it destroys our false views about suffering. It destroys, it demolishes, it erases our false views of suffering when we realize that no one is immune to it. So whether you're sitting in the armchair, whether you're sitting in the wheelchair, there are false teachings that are prominent in our day, in our society, that will destroy your faith and that are tools of your destruction in the enemy's hands. And it is important, this is my pastoral protection of you guys coming out. It is important that you learn and that you accept lesson number one, that no one is immune to suffering, because it smashes false teaching and false belief on suffering. Well, here are three beliefs that are false beliefs that it smashes. First, it smashes the notion of the prosperity gospel. You may know it as the health and wealth gospel. The health and wealth gospel does not work when you read Job right. No one is immune from suffering. Now, basically, the prosperity gospel is the teaching that it's always God's will for you to be healthy and wealthy. And if you're not healthy and wealthy, it's because of some spiritual deficiency within you. It's because of some kind of false belief or not having enough faith in your life, and that's why you experience suffering or poorness, poverty. That's what the prosperity gospel teaches. The airways, the cable channels, Christian bookstores are packed full of proponents of this prosperity gospel. If you name a popular preacher, then it's most likely they're going to, that this is what they hold to. So you've got guys like Benny Hinn, that would hold to this. You've got guys like Joel Osteen that hold to this. You've got teachers like Joyce Meyer that hold to the prosperity gospel, and they do teach this. And so some of y'all are listening to prosperity gospel preaching, and you need to stop. I'm just warning you as your pastor. That's part of my job. But it's not healthy for you. And so this notion that no one is immune from suffering clashes against the prosperity gospel, because they say that no, it's possible for you to be immune from suffering if you just have enough faith. And so lesson number one is in direct contradiction to the prosperity gospel. As you know, we go on mission trips to India quite frequently at our church, and we take trips there, and we take groups there, and we work with church planners there. And one of the things that saddens my heart is that when we go there often, we hear this testimony that prosperity gospel preaching has just taken hold in all these poor villages. And they're like, we hate it. Like, it destroys biblical faith. And these are guys that they don't have some kind of American theological axe to grind. They just see the damage it causes for people. Because they, of all people, know that no one is immune from suffering, but then in comes this gospel that preaches, no, you can be immune from suffering if you don't have enough faith. And then guess what? People buy into that, and they're good until they suffer. And then when they suffer, here's what they think. What I was told is a lie. Christianity must be a lie. Jesus must be a lie. And so they totally, completely reject the gospel, reject the Bible, and reject God as a result of the prosperity preaching. Y'all get what I'm saying? My Aunt Lisa lost her husband to cancer, testicular cancer, when he was in his 30s. They had 2 teenage boys. Or, well, they were small boys, 10-ish, around that time. And she was going to a church that preached a prosperity gospel, and so in the midst of her husband, who was a great man of God, who had actually sold his, they were rich by my standards. I mean, they sold he was a contractor, and they sold their business and went away to school so he could be a Christian counselor, walked away from everything. They were great people of faith. They walked with Jesus, and they're going to this church that preached the prosperity gospel. And so literally during his sickness and after his sickness, after he had passed away, there are people from the church, including the pastor, coming to them and saying, you know what, if y'all just trusted Jesus a little bit more, this wouldn't have happened. This didn't have to happen. My Aunt Lisa knows how destructive the prosperity gospel is, and you guys need to know that too. So if you've bought into the prosperity gospel, and yet the biblical principle is that no one is immune from suffering, then it will destroy your faith when suffering comes. Don't buy into a false teaching on that. Second reason we need this teaching, second reason we need lesson number 1, or the second false view, sorry, I'm getting confused. The second false view that this destroys not only is the prosperity gospel, but secondly, the therapeutic gospel. The therapeutic gospel. So, what if you're already rich? Then what do you hold to? What if you're rich and healthy? Then the prosperity gospel may not have as much draw for you. And maybe you're sitting here and you're thinking, well, this isn't the case for me because I'm not rich, but let me just tell you, by world standards, are you rich? Yep. You are, by world standards. And so we have a lot of stuff, and you know, maybe you're healthy, you're married, you've got kids, everything's going well, not perfect, but you're generally happy. So what happens to the prosperity gospel when you already enjoy prosperity? Well, it changes, it metamorphosizes into what we call the therapeutic gospel. And here's what the therapeutic gospel is. And there is church upon church, upon church, upon church, upon church, that this is the gospel they preach. It's called the therapeutic gospel. And here's what the therapeutic gospel does. The therapeutic gospel says, you know what? Since your issue isn't prosperity, since your issue isn't maybe health, here's what Jesus can help you just feel better about yourself. Osteen is one of the greatest proponents of what I would call the therapeutic gospel. It's all about you feeling good. It's all about Jesus being your therapist. It's all about what Jesus can do to you and how you can be a better, live a better life today or whatever it may be. But it's just the Jesus that makes you feel good. Well, when you look at the book of Job, Job addresses in a deep and unsettling way the false gospel of prosperity and the false gospel of feeling good, of therapy, because truthfully, Job does not feel good. The therapeutic gospel, like if you have Jesus, you'll just feel better. That's not true. Listen now, it's possible for you to be a Christian and a man of great faith just as Job was, and you be trusting God, but you feel really bad. Some of y'all know what that means. You feel really bad and you think there has to be something wrong with you. And I'm telling you, there could be something wrong with you, but there might not be something wrong with you. Because suffering puts us in the shoes of Job. And even when we're walking in the shoes of Job, it's still possible to honor God. A third false view that this truth smashes is the Christian entitlement view. Now this is probably what's going to be the battle that most of you face, that I face. And here's what it is. And it may sound a little similar to the other views, but I gave it its own category because this is what many of us do. So we here at Grace, like we're rejecting the prosperity gospel, we're rejecting the therapeutic gospel, but quietly we're embracing the notion of Christian entitlement. Now here's what that means. This notion is typically revealed in us when we first come to sit in the wheelchair. So it's typically not, once again, it's typically not revealed that it's there in us until we have to sit in the wheelchair, until great suffering comes to us, and then when at first great suffering comes to us, this is when this is revealed. This is when the light shines in the dark corner of our heart and shows us what's really there. And here's what it shows us. When we first sit in the wheelchair, here's how we know we've given into this Christian entitlement view. We begin to ask questions like this. You know, I just don't understand why this happened to me. I'm living for Jesus. I read my Bible. I go to church. I give. I serve. I evangelize. I'm involved in community group. God, why me? It's this idea that because you're serving God, God should always never let anything bad happen to you. So we feel like God has betrayed us. We're sitting here and we're like, okay, God, if this is how you repay someone who loves you like I love you? Y'all get what I'm saying? God, this is how you treat someone who loves you, someone who is your child and who serves you? Why did I do all that if you're just going to treat me like this? When suffering hits you and you ask that question, all that does is it reveals the dark corner of your heart that is given into Christian entitlement. This idea that just because you're a Christian, that you are entitled to protection from all things. As if God is some kind of club that protects you from bullies. This is not what the Bible teaches, and it is not what the Bible promises. God does not promise us, ever in Scripture, that just because we live for Him, nothing bad will happen to us. Now, if we buy into that view of Christian entitlement, we think we'll begin to accuse God of being unjust, will we not? We will. The First Council of Nicaea, which was convened by Emperor Constantine in AD 325, was the first worldwide conference of the Christian church. And so the worldwide church kind of got together in 325, and at that council, they settled a lot of great doctrinal matters that people were having questions about in the Christian faith. So, like the deity of Christ was kind of settled once and for all at that time. The Nicene Creed, a creed of Orthodox faith that is still used, was kind of set and adopted at that point. Now, here's why I'm telling you about the Council of Nicaea. At that council, it was a gathering of 318 pastors and Christian theologians and leaders in the world at that time. So of the 318 delegates to the First Nicene Council, historically, we know that only 12 of them were what they called whole in body. Only 12 of them were whole in body. Now, here's what I mean by that. All but 12 of the 318 had been maimed or crippled as a result of being tortured for their faith in Jesus. Many of them had lost an eye or a hand. Others had suffered broken and dislocated limbs. Some had been scarred by branding irons. Now here's the point. From the earliest days, the Christian church has recognized this. No one thought it was strange or unfair to suffer for Jesus. There was not the prosperity gospel. There was not the therapeutic gospel. There was not the Christian entitlement gospel. Suffering was considered a normal part of the Christian experience. This is still true. Lesson number 1 is what? How many people? No one is immune to suffering. No one. There's no such thing as Christian entitlement from suffering. No one is immune for suffering. All right? So it smashes, the second reason we need lesson number 1 is because it smashes false teaching about suffering, that if you don't have that smashed in your life, you're going to get to a really bad place when you sit here. It'll destroy you. The third reason we need lesson number 1. Third reason we need to do a study on suffering. Number 3. Reason number 3. We need this study because it drives you to prepare, and it drives me to preach in such a way that you will not curse God in the day of your calamity. Let me say that again. It drives you to prepare yourself, and it drives me to preach so as to prepare you in such a way that you will not curse God when you sit here. When you sit here, and you're all going to sit here at some point, when you sit here, I don't want you to curse God when you sit here. Like Job's wife told him to do. Curse God and die, Job. I don't want you to do that. And so as your pastor, I'm standing before you this morning and I'm saying, I want you to stand strong in the day of your calamity. I want you to honor the Lord as Job does in the day of his calamity. Preacher, we got to face a hard week. We don't need stuff like this on Sundays. We just need encouragement. Well, that's not realistic. That's not the world that we live in. It doesn't do us good just to be positive. It's not life, because that's not life. That's not reality. We can't live in denial of lesson number 1, that no one is immune from suffering. That doesn't help you. You might be sitting in a restaurant about to meet a blind date. You might be loading up your car for vacation with your family. Or you might be shaving when you suddenly discover a lump on your neck. You might be out camping only to discover that your 2-year-old is missing. No warning. You may go for the routine checkup only to find out that you got 6 months to live. You may kiss your husband, your wife, your kids goodbye as they drive away, never to be seen again. Listen, when that day comes, you're going to be tempted. The evil one is going to come after you. And he's going to say this, that he says about Job in verse 9. Then Satan answered the Lord and said, Does Job fear God for no reason? Have you not put a hedge around him and his house and all that he has on every side? You've blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face. And that is the test that you will face that day that you sit here. Will you curse God, or will you lift your holy hand in praise to him? What will you do on that day? And when that day comes, You're going to be ready because you're listening and you're taking to heart what we're talking about. I don't want you to curse God, but I want you to extol God on the day of your calamity. So lesson number 1 is that no one is immune for suffering. Are you ready? Do you know how to face this view? Are you taking seriously this calling this morning, this warning? Here's what we're going to do right now. I want you to kind of break up into groups, kind of with people around where you're at. Make sure no one's left out. Break up into groups of 5 or 6. And here's what I want to ask you to do. I just want to ask that someone in that group, and I know you may be shy, don't feel like you have to pray, but I want to ask that you would just pray with each other and for each other. Y'all with me? But I don't want to just ask that you pray for each other. I want to ask specifically that you, as you huddle in that huddle together, that you pray that God would strengthen them and strengthen everyone in your circle right then, so that they may stand on the day that they have to sit in the wheelchair. Y'all with me? And then whenever your group feels like being done, you're dismissed. Okay? So let's break into those groups right now.